Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be diving deep into how culture fundamentally shapes the human mind, and, by extension, therapeutic practice. Now, our goal today isn't just to memorize some textbook definitions, right? We really want to teach this in depth and help you remember these core concepts for the long haul. So, let's look at how to actually fundamentally shift your psychological lens. Here's our cognitive map for today. We're going to navigate through 5 key areas. First, the multicultural shift. Then, the power of worldview, followed by individualism versus collectivism. After that, we'll look at hidden barriers to treatment. And finally, building multicultural competence. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The multicultural shift. Moving beyond Western assumptions. Let's talk about why earlier psychological theories were frankly pretty limited and needed a massive overhaul.
For a really long time, the field of psychology operated with a massive blind spot. I mean, think about the traditional counseling models you're probably familiar with. They were overwhelmingly developed within Western, white, middle-class societies. And the real problem wasn't just where they were developed, but this huge assumption that these models were universal, that they applied perfectly to literally every human being on the planet. Well, multicultural scholars completely challenged this. They pointed out that culture isn't just some optional add-on. It dictates everything from how we process our emotions and form our identity to how we ask for help and what we expect from therapy.
Moving on to Section 2, the power of worldview, the psychological lens of reality. This concept right here is absolutely crucial because it forms the foundation of all effective communication and therapy. Let's break down this definition. A worldview is essentially the collection of assumptions, beliefs, values, attitudes, and perceptions through which an individual interprets reality. Now, to really lock this into your memory, I want you to anchor it to a metaphor. Think of a worldview as a pair of psychological glasses. It's the specific lens through which a person understands suffering, defines success, views spirituality, and even interprets family obligations. Basically, a behavior only makes sense or has meaning when you look at it through the worldview in which it exists.
This brilliantly illustrates the danger of ignoring that lens. Just imagine a Western counselor who highly values independent decision-making. They see it as a true sign of maturity, right? But sitting across from them is a client from a collectivistic culture who values family consultation, seeing that dynamic as healthy interdependence. If the counselor evaluates that client strictly through their own Western glasses, they are incredibly likely to completely misdiagnose that healthy interdependence as immaturity or some sort of unhealthy dependency. And as you can guess, that completely shatters the therapeutic relationship.
And this danger extends directly to how clinical symptoms are interpreted. For example, a profound spiritual experience that is totally normal, even celebrated in one culture, might be mislabeled as a pathological or psychotic symptom in another. Or consider a cultural norm of emotional restraint. A Western therapist might easily misjudge that as unhealthy emotional suppression. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that effective multicultural counseling requires you to hit pause on your own assumptions. You really have to view reality entirely from the client's perspective to avoid making these damaging, inaccurate diagnoses.
Okay, Section 3, individualism versus collectivism, contrasting cultural values. Let's see how worldview builds into one of the biggest, most influential contrasts in multicultural psychology.
Traditional counseling really champions individualistic traits, things like personal autonomy, independence, open self-expression, and the relentless pursuit of individual goals. But we've got to remember that many cultures across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and indigenous communities prioritize collectivism. In those contexts, a person's identity is deeply tied to family loyalty, interpersonal harmony, cooperation, and fulfilling collective duties rather than just individual selfhood. It's a completely different way of operating.
To really cement this in your mind, let's look at a practical, real-world outcome. Imagine a traditional therapist advising an Asian client to just prioritize their own personal desires over their family's expectations. Now, in a Western framework, that sounds like a great breakthrough, right? But for this client, pushing that kind of individualistic autonomy might actively produce severe guilt, massive interpersonal conflict, and profound emotional distress. It doesn't lead to growth, actually it causes harm. This proves a vital rule to remember. Neither cultural framework is objectively superior. A culturally competent counselor seeks understanding, not judgment. Moving on to Section 4, hidden barriers to treatment, microaggressions, culture, and class. Now that we understand these varying worldviews, let's explore the invisible walls that block effective care. So, ask yourself this. Is traditional counseling actually, truly, scientifically neutral?
Well, multicultural scholars argue that it absolutely is not. The reality is, counseling is inherently culture-bound. It often demands very direct communication, deep self-exploration, and open emotional disclosure. But what happens when a client belongs to a culture that highly values restraint, indirect communication, and privacy? Well, methods that feel perfectly therapeutic to the counselor can end up feeling deeply inappropriate and uncomfortable for the client.
This brings us to microaggressions. These are subtle, verbal, behavioral, or environmental messages that communicate negative or stereotypical assumptions towards marginalized groups. Now, unlike overt, intentional discrimination, microaggressions are tricky because they're often entirely unintentional. They can just slip out without the speaker even having conscious awareness of their bias. But make no mistake, their cumulative psychological impact on the receiver is absolutely massive.
For example, imagine a refugee hearing, "Wow, you speak surprisingly good English," or someone saying, "You do not look disabled." While statements like these might genuinely seem harmless or even like compliments to the person saying them, they are microaggressions. They loudly communicate exclusionary assumptions about who belongs, who is intelligent, and who is considered normal. When a counselor commits a microaggression like this, they instantly undermine trust, making the clinical space feel incredibly unsafe and invalidating for the client.
Another major hidden barrier is social class. Traditional counseling often operates with an insight focus, which basically assumes clients have the luxury of time and resources to do extensive self-analysis and long-term future planning. But multicultural counseling emphasizes that we really can't separate culture from social class. I mean, we can't expect a client who is desperately trying to secure food, housing, or immediate employment to sit in a chair and just focus on psychodynamic insight. Their day-to-day reality demands practical survival solutions, not deep dives into their internal conflicts.
When dealing with the brutal systemic stressors of poverty, things like housing instability, food insecurity, lack of employment, unequal access to healthcare, and transportation barriers, there's a huge danger for counselors: pathologizing poverty. It is way too easy to misinterpret a client's severe fatigue, irritability, reduced motivation, or hopelessness as some sort of personality defect or clinical pathology. We have to step back and recognize it for what it is: a completely normal reaction to the grinding reality of environmental stress and structural inequality.
Because of all these factors, assessment and diagnosis absolutely must be culturally informed. This means actively considering a client's language, their migration history, educational background, and their experiences of discrimination. It's actually kind of shocking how often heavily culturally biased standardized tests are still relied upon today. For instance, if you fail to account for limited English proficiency or different educational norms on a standardized exam, it can easily lead to a disastrous misdiagnosis of cognitive impairment. So, assessment just has to be a comprehensive, culturally informed process.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Building Multicultural Competence, the AMCD framework. With all these hidden barriers in mind, how do we actually solve this? Let's break it down into an actionable model. To help you commit this solution to memory, let's walk through 3 specific steps outlined by the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. Step 1 requires a deep awareness of your own cultural identity, your biases, and your privileges. Step 2 is all about understanding the client's worldview and life experiences completely, without judgment. And Step 3 requires developing culturally appropriate interventions, which means adapting how you communicate and recognizing community resources. This framework is a game changer because it takes all this theory and transforms it into a highly ethical, actionable practice. A massive part of that ethical practice is recognizing that traditional counseling's focus on just helping a client adapt to their environment, well, it's no longer enough. Social justice counseling requires the professional to become an advocate, a consultant, an educator, and a real agent of social change. Because mental health is intrinsically tied to systemic issues like racism, ableism, sexism, and poverty. Effective counselors literally cannot just stay hidden in their offices. They have to step out, coordinate resources, address accessibility barriers, and advocate for justice to help remove the very barriers that are causing the psychological suffering in the first place.
And that brings us to the core takeaway of our entire explainer today. Multicultural competence isn't a final destination. You don't just check a box and say you're done. It requires lifelong humility, flexibility, and critical thinking. So I want to leave you with a vital question to consider in literally all of your human interactions moving forward. How will you shift your lens today to ensure you are seeing the actual person in front of you and not just your own cultural reflection? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the lens through which you view the world.